or young people in general who are affected by election barriers, not only when they're in college, but after they graduate. So I can think of my own case. First 5 years my wife and I were married, I think I counted it up the other day, we lived in 9 different places. Mm-hmm. Is that unusual?
It is not unusual. If you think about it, college students, they move during the summer, so they might just move out of their dorm and live in the same town, mm-hmm. but they're not living in the dorm or they're not living in that student housing. So a large number of students, and then also after you graduate, you're looking for a job, you might be living with friends, and younger people are highly mobile. So they definitely will be affected, and in fact, with the possible photo ID requirement, we have August elections now for the primaries. Yes. So students would have to get one voter ID or ID to vote in the August primary and another ID to vote in the November general. And what's important to realize here is that Minnesota State would have to provide free IDs for anyone that doesn't have one. So we would have to get IDs for all the primary voters, and then once they move, we have to go and get another set of IDs for them to vote in the general election. Same people, but the simple fact that they moved, they'd have to get a new ID.
And ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching for the state of Minnesota. I mean,
exactly.
To get these IDs, it's going to cost them some money too.
Especially if you think about the students coming in September and the rush they'll have to go and get those IDs before Election Day. It's not just the students that are going to be rushing around, it's going to be the county auditors and the local DMVs that have to get those IDs to the students. Otherwise, the students could have a case against the DMV if they didn't provide it fast enough.
Now, this program is being produced by the Minnesota State Retiree Council, mm-hmm. So I have to ask the question, how are older voters potentially affected?
There's been a number of national studies that have documented that older people have a high rate of not having a valid ID. And that could be that some of them move quite a bit. You think about going to assisted care facilities. They might not have an ID once they move there. Also, some people may not be driving, so they, again, might not have a reason to have the specific IDs that the state of Minnesota would have to create if there was a photo ID requirement.
Mm-hmm. And let's explore the demographics a bit further. How about people in rural areas?
Oh, rural voters, there's something that we have here called mail-in precincts in Minnesota, and it's in rural areas where someone will get the ballot and then they complete it and mail it back, or if they want to, they can go and take it to the county auditor. Now, those specific people in rural Minnesota would have to somehow get an ID to vote, because it would be a requirement for all voters. If we were to do what they do in Wisconsin, they would have to find a photocopier to photocopy their ID. And that could be really difficult because most people don't have a photocopier in their houses.
Yeah. They could very well might have to drive 20, 30, 40, 50 miles.
Exactly.
To a place that would have a photocopier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This comes very close to the next category of people I have in mind, that is people serving the armed forces, either in this country or around the world someplace. How would they be affected by voter ID?
Well, it's important to note, again, looking at what was vetoed, a military ID, the ID that is used when you're in Iraq, would not be good enough to be used to vote in Minnesota. And that with that vetoed bill, they only allowed for 3 IDs, and that is your driver's license, a Minnesota State issued ID, or a voter ID. So someone that has just served recently, come to Minnesota with their military ID, they couldn't use that. So it would definitely impact them. There is federal legislation that might mean that they would have be able to use their passport or something like that. But again, if they came here to Minnesota, they would have to follow our rules.
So a man or woman who is defending our country may not be able to exercise the right to vote, or at the very least there'd be some barriers, some hoops that they would have to jump through.
Yeah, in fact, I'll tell you this. My 2 brothers served in Iraq, and they didn't see each other that often, and one brother actually was here for leave, and during Election Day, he went and voted, and the very next day he flew off to Iraq. Now, his ID didn't reflect his old address because he was living in an apartment, so he couldn't have used his military ID. They might have given him a provisional ballot, but he was in Iraq by the time they were announcing the results.
Okay, let's look at another category of people. Battered women who may be living in a shelter would not have an ID that would reflect that is where they're living on election day.
That's so true, and it's not even battered women who are living in a shelter. It's battered women who fled to their mothers or their sisters.
Yeah.
There were some discussions about creating exemptions for battered women and battered women's shelter. Now, when a woman flees or a spouse flees another spouse, they often are fleeing for their life. They don't grab their birth certificate, they don't grab their marriage certificate, they usually grab their kids and get out, and they don't want to go back. So they would definitely be impacted by this.
And as you say, they could be with a friend or a relative of one type or another.
It's not that unusual for someone to try to flee to their parents.
What about a homeless person? Does a homeless person have a right to vote?
Yes, a homeless person, as long as they meet the requirements that we have here in Minnesota, has every right to vote. And there are safeguards in place. So if a homeless person is living on the street right now, someone can vouch for them. They could say, I know that they've been living there. So it's unfortunate they're doing that. They would need to have an ID based on their current address if they live in a homeless shelter. So yeah, they would be impacted.
Okay, and this whole area of absentee ballots then is harmed, I'll say, by a voter ID.
Exactly. Absentee voters would have to have a valid ID. Some people say, well, if you can't get an ID, you can vote absentee, and that is not an excuse. And again, if we follow what happens in Wisconsin, an absentee voter is going to have to find a photocopier. Most absentee voters would have to find a photocopier and photocopy their valid ID.
So, does a college student or young person have an absolute right to vote?
As long as they fit the requirements, definitely, yes.
Older voter?
Yes.
Person in rural area?
Yes.
Person in the armed forces?
Mm-hmm.
Person who's fleeing
An
abusive home, homeless people. These are all categories of people that are real people.
Yes.
That are real people, and as with all of us, have an absolute right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in thinking about voting, we hear about I hear some various terms that come up from time to time, and I know some of them. I don't know all of them. I've read conflicting accounts in Minnesota about the use of tribal ID as a legal ID. What exactly is the situation with tribal ID for Native Americans?
In Minnesota, we do have a number of different tribes, and they are sovereign nations. Mm-hmm. They can use their tribal ID to register to vote on Election Day here in Minnesota currently. But based on the vetoed bill, only if those IDs followed the state IDs, so if they had to have the same information on it, could they be used. And the problem with that is that it would be the Minnesota state government telling a sovereign nation what to put on their IDs, and that's wrong.
Yes, and you have a question of where is the person with the tribal ID living? Mm-hmm. Is he or she living in northern Minnesota or southern Minnesota, or is that person living in the metro area? Provisional ballot. Now that's the one I really don't get. So
provisional ballots are, some people call them a safeguard. I see them as a problem. In Ohio, they recently had an election that was won by 23 votes, but there were 849 provisional ballots that were cast at the wrong precinct. The voters went to the right door, they went to the wrong precinct. They're not counting those. There's a big court case about that right now. But a provisional voter has to fill out the forms on Election Day. Additional election judges would be required to work with them. They take those provisional ballots to the county auditors, and the voters will have to drive. They'll get the identifying information, and they'll have to drive and get the documentation to vote. So it's cumbersome. It is not a safeguard. It is far from a safeguard.
So if you enter a building, you go down the left hallway instead of the right hallway, you're in trouble.
If it follows what happened in Ohio, definitely yes.
Okay. What is identity fraud?
When someone can go and pretend to be who you are. So it's very, very rare that occurs when it comes to voting.
Okay. So You mentioned Ohio a couple times. What is happening around the nation?
Well, in Maine, there was what I call a witch hunt. Someone provided 200 names to the Secretary of State and said, we believe these college students who live in a different state voted twice, once in that state, once here. And the Secretary of State went and analyzed the data and could not find any problems. Those students did not vote twice in the same election. They had every right to vote in the place that they live. They paid taxes where they live. So recently, they decided, well, let's let the students or the citizens decide whether or not they could have election day registration. They were going to put this barrier up in place in Maine, and there was a great citizens veto. The citizens said, we believe in election day registration. We believe that this is a right for citizens, and so that citizens veto passed.
And again, I hear the word right come in there.
Definitely.
Voting is an absolute right. Now, in a previous life, I was a teacher for 35 years, and I taught civics a large part of that time. And I used to teach how voting, the right to vote, has expanded throughout our history. At one time, you had to own property. One time, you had to be a male. You had to be a white male. You had to be 21 or older in most cases. And until fairly recently, by my mind, if you lived in Washington, D.C., you could not vote for president. All that has changed. All that has changed. So this amendment, or possible amendment, is going in the opposite direction from other amendments that we've had to the U.S. Constitution about expanding the right to vote. So this amendment puts up new barriers.
It definitely creates barriers. I mean, we have no documented case of voter impersonation here in Minnesota. So creating a barrier to vote makes no sense. The barrier, again, of photo ID only documents identity.
Okay. And I just want to touch quickly on cost involved with photo ID. Is there any estimate on how much this would cost to local counties?
It definitely would.
Cities?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It definitely would cost. People often say, "Well, all we have to do is pay for the ID. All we have to do that." But based on what happened in other states, like Georgia or Indiana, we would have to pay for outreach to educate voters on this new requirement. And they recently were doing that in Tennessee, and they found out a lot of people knew about the voter ID requirement, but didn't know that a student ID wasn't a proper ID. So there's a lot of work that's done in that. Creating this provisional voting system, we have to get additional election judges on election day to go and review those provisional ballots, and then we have to have people on the other end, provisional ballot judges that would go and review those and count those. And then, of course, the free IDs, again, air quotes, free IDs, because the state's going to have to pay for those. And then individual voters will have to go and pay for supporting documents.
Okay. And right now, you and I are driving our director crazy, and his entire award-winning crew. We're about out of time. Just quickly, how can people get involved within Minnesota or in helping friends and relatives in other states who face election barriers?
Number one, talk to your friends and family about this. A lot of people think that it's a common sense solution, and it isn't. It doesn't make any sense. It's a problem. It's the exact opposite. You have to talk to your friends about it. Contact us. We're creating a speakers bureau. You can join our speakers bureau. We'll train you in that. Or if you want to have a speaker come to you or your community, we'll do that. Like us on Facebook. Again, we're Citizens for Election Integrity Minnesota. We are posting information up there. But whatever you do, don't be quiet and don't assume someone else is going to do something.
Thank you, Kathy Bonnifield, Executive Director of Citizens for Election Integrity, for being with us today and sharing your voting expertise as we have looked at the very scary topic of potential voter suppression in Minnesota. Our thanks to the entire crew for the Minnesota State Retiree Council, AFL-CIO, for making this production possible.